moving on to the next session, when it comes to creative, we cannot go on with a monolithic attitude toward communication that appears in digital media. The next session is focused on raising our expectations and standards for ideas that work in digital. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Rogers and Ped Howard. Over to you.
And welcome. Digital advertising is dead. And this esteemed panel that we've put together today of creators and strategists and researchers in the digital creative space are going to tell you why it is dead, and of course also how it can be reborn in new and more effective ways. So let me start by introducing our esteemed panel. Please could you share the slide of our folks here. I'd love to welcome, first of all, Barb Williams, who is a VP at Sonic Drive-In for customer experience strategy, brand marketing, and regional activation. Thank you for joining us, Barb. Pierre Lipton, who joins us from McCann in New York City. He's the Global Executive Creative Director there and has particular oversight of the MasterCard advertising campaign. He will be talking to us about his experience creating some of that wonderful work. Thank you for joining us, Pierre. And also Tara Putman joins us from Kellogg, where she's Director of Next Gen Insights. Tara has some fantastic experience to share of Kellogg's journey, learning in the digital space. And last but not least, our own Ped Howard from Ipsos. Ped is an SVP here in the Creative Excellence service line. So without further ado, let's resuscitate digital advertising. Ped, kick us off, please. Why do we talk at Ipsos about the death of the digital ad?
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everybody. So Rachel and I work within the Creative Excellence division at Ipsos. And in a nutshell, the role of our group is to help clients improve the advertising that they run. In many different ways, the goal is to make that advertising more effective. So what I'd like to clarify before we go any further, because I'm sure you're all thinking, what's going on here? When we talk about the death of digital advertising, we absolutely don't mean the end of using digital media to reach consumers with advertising. However, what we would argue is that the term digital advertising has become so bloated as to be meaningless, except in terms of the dollars and cents you put on a media plan. From an advertiser perspective, or from a creative angle, what does a digital ad even mean? We've put here the IAB industry definition, and then we've brought in a typical chart on the breakout of what counts as digital advertising. And when you think about creative executions, what's really the point in calling all of this digital? We're bundling search optimization with social. Social is distinct from digital video, despite a lot of social being video. And yet so much of our industry still silos off digital advertising, whether that's using a different agency or following an entirely different path for how to research your digital advertising compared to, say, your TV or your traditional media. So we'd say that this is a very internal-facing, industry-centric model. And that's always a red flag for me, because one of the most important and timeless lessons in marketing is being consumer-centric. So in terms of making more effective advertising, what we would suggest is to think much more about the viewer experience. How do they engage with ads? And how does that impact how we communicate with the viewer? So when we use our Creative Spark methodology to assess video advertising, one of the strengths we have is that we can change the context of how people view that ad. We use the same core method regardless of how this is going to be experienced in the real world, but what we're looking at is whether people are experiencing it and how they can interact with it. So we would separate linear video, which we would define as you're going to watch the whole ad from start to finish, possibly around other ads before you get to the content that you want. We look at skippable, and that obviously people understand what that means is that at some point before you get to your content, you can skip the rest of the ad. So you're forced to watch some of it, but then it goes. And then we have in feed, where you're not even directly exposed to it other than it appears on your feed as you're scrolling. It's an even more passive way of being distracted and missing the ad altogether if you're not careful. So just 3 different ways, and that's kind of the first layer before we get in any further. But we would much rather break out how advertising is viewed across this platform than talk about digital versus TV as if this is completely different. Because a linear digital ad on something like Hulu in a commercial break has a lot more in common with how people would experience advertising on NBC or ABC than it does with a lot of what else is bundled in with digital advertising. And just to highlight that point, and think about how we should be viewing this differently, just a couple of example ads where we tested the same video unit across different platforms and different viewability experiences. And you see vastly different between when something is shown in a linear to when it's shown in either a skippable or an in-feed environment. And what we really need to think about is, let's get more specific with our digital advertising. Let's think about it from a viewer perspective, how they're going to consume the content and the advertising, and how we can make that more engaging for them.
Great, yes, Ped. So it's not one size fits all. And Tara, let me bring you in here. The Kellogg team has done a huge amount of creative exploration to really get the best out of the different digital formats that you're using to support your brands. Tell us a little bit about your journey here.
Yeah, and I'll speak to a multi-decade journey that we've been on regarding digital advertising. And I think a lot of the internal roadblocks really are born out of the way we have approached creative development over time. And in the olden days, when TV was the primary investment module, then that's where we would invest the time to do an animatic and do pre-testing, and digital would come very late in the development. So once the idea was fully baked from a TV perspective and we were sure the direction we were headed, then digital would kind of get developed out of that TV idea in cut downs maybe of the same film, or stills taken during the same shoot. So in desire of trying to keep things synergistic and consistent across media touch points, I think the design for context was sort of lost in that model. And so what we've learned over time is there definitely is synergy between, we see better in-market results, for example, when your OLV on YouTube has something in common with the TV that's running in linear, but you have to approach them from a perspective of what is the message that's best going to be delivered in this medium, and what's the storyline or the approach in terms of the creative that's going to leverage the best practices in that context. And so that may mean we have 4 different shoots or 4 different scripts within the same shoot designed for OLV, skippable, and linear, that each kind of take into consideration what's going to work in that environment. And then we need to test to make sure those things are true.
Great, Pierre, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Well, I think that, yeah, I moved into quote unquote digital advertising before many of my peers did when I came from traditional. And, one of the things that I think has been true, no matter if we're talking about the development of digital ad units or working in social or doing something innovative, is that you have to design from the beginning with that in mind. And really the process I've followed for a very long time now is bringing different subject matter experts into the briefing process really early on, because adaptation is, in my experience, death. It may solve a little bit of an issue on paper in terms of someone's budget, but at the end of the day, it's not going to give you units that provide value or any real meaning for the consumer or the client. Right.
I would love to share an example of Kellogg's advertising at this point. This ad is really a best-in-class example of something that was run in a skippable environment and really checks some boxes with humor and product demos.
Made with real fruit and whole grains kids will actually eat. Kellogg's Nutri-Grain. Come prepared.
Okay, that was the 6-second version, unintentionally so. But that actually is a great segue for us to talk a little bit about skipability. One of the questions that we get regularly is the extent to which skipability is a problem. Is it actually harmful to the goals of an advertiser to have their ad skipped? That's an excellent question. So we decided to dig into that a little bit, and we have some interesting information to share here.
Sure, yes. So, I mean, it probably doesn't come as any big surprise to know that one of the biggest drivers of success in skippable ads is whether people actually skip the ad or not. And that the longer people watch the ad for, the higher all of your key metrics are going to go up. Now, again, I'm not saying this is groundbreaking evidence, but what it does mean is that we can get a lot more granular into both what drives skipability and what drives performance, and start to think about how to make stronger advertising for a skippable environment. One of the obvious ones that we've dug into at first is the use of humor. Now, humor is definitely a strong way to keep people's attention. If there's a joke coming either early or they want the payoff, people will stick around to watch that humor. And we see that that improves particularly our visibility metric and the ability to get that retransmission and shared. And we see that less than 25% of ads that we test in a skippable environment use humor, but that almost all of them fall into the top performers in a skippable environment. We've been going through this exercise for a bunch of different codes. Other things that seem to work very well are both a direct gaze and a tight shot to camera. And one that doesn't work so well is vignettes with lots of moving parts and different pieces. That really doesn't work in a skippable environment, and generally we see weaker performance. But I think, we can get into the granular building blocks in the way that what we see on the back end. I think it would be really great to hear from Pierre on how you construct ads that might perform well in this environment.
Well, I think, what's important really for me is backing up into like what is the overarching goal and the channel planning for the consumer. Like, this is one place that I think it's very important that you design things for this space and are intentional. But at the same time, I think that you have to have a larger role in people's lives as a brand, and maybe Skippable isn't the place to establish that role, right? So the other thing that strikes me is it makes sense what you're saying. These are very objective data points, but the ingredients themselves are subjective. What is funny to you versus what's funny to me, and so it's useful up to a point, I think, to use this data, but there is a pretty wide range of how one would bring these findings to life, if you know what I mean. One of the things I've told students for many years is an ad is sort of like trying to introduce yourself to someone at a party, across a crowded room. And when you approach someone, and I was looking at your data, some of the data you shared with me, and I think there's a pretty interesting correlation. But when you are introduced to someone, you definitely, you mentioned direct gaze. It's useful when you introduce yourself to look in someone's eyes. And oftentimes people instinctually open with a joke, But all that stuff only gets you so far. It gets you a certain amount of consideration. What you or your brand means from that point forward is really part of a much, much larger picture. And the skippable unit is just that little slice, if you will.
Pierre, I'd love to share some of your MasterCard work, and we have a couple of examples here. One is a very anthemic piece for the True Name campaign. And then there is a piece in the same campaign that you developed for an in-feed environment, a video in-feed environment. Maybe we could just play those two pieces, and then would love to get your perspective on the differences in those creative executions, and how you thought about adapting, the overall idea you had for True Name and making it work in very different ways.
For transgender people, a secure payment doesn't mean protecting yourself from someone buying sneakers with your card. No, if you're transgender, a secure payment means paying for something without being judged, questioned, disrespected, humiliated, harassed, even assaulted, simply because the name on your card doesn't match how you identify. This is about more than just keeping a card safe. It's about keeping us safe. True Name by MasterCard, the first card that allows you to display your chosen name because that's who you truly are.
And then let's play our in-feed example.
It's everything to have your name right.
So, you know, there's a clear campaign feel here, right? An idea, but executed differently. Love to hear how you think about that, how you approach that, Pierre, in your discussions with the creative team.
It's a matter of context, someone's context, how much time they have and where they are, you know, to tell your story. And I think what's interesting when we take this example is both units, you know, it's really hard to separate the unit from the fact that this was part of a much larger campaign and effort on behalf of a brand that was conceptual, you know, was designed to help their customers in a very real way. So I think it's hard to compare, you know, something with that to something that may not have a sense of purpose or a role in someone's life. But, you know, when it came to the specifics, yes, we wanted to hear directly from the actors, as they're all trans actors in the spots, and we interviewed them to hear their stories so that one would, whether it's in feed when you don't have a lot of time or when you have a little bit more time, would empathize if you were not part of the community and begin to understand their experience. And I think speaking directly to someone and, you know, doing as short as possible is super important in feed.
Yeah, one of those, a great example of one of those things that we found, that speaking very tightly framed, very engaging approach to stop people's thumbing through the feed, right? Barb, let's hear from you. You have you've mastered many aspects of being successful in different contexts. Perhaps you could specifically just talk to us a little bit about your briefing process and how you think about the different messaging pillars that you have at Sonic and how they are worked through different channels effectively.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, thanks for having me. And so we have really evolved and grown over even the last few years in how we think about our briefing process and specifically who our core targets are and where we speak to them, meaning, you know, which channel, which medium. and so as opposed to, like, you know, just listening to Tara speak and then also Pierre, as opposed to taking linear TV creative and just cutting it down into a sizable fit into a different platform. It is about who is that core target that you are trying to reach on social media, and then what is that message, and really designing a message. It may, of course, same campaign, but the message is a little bit different. Based on the platform, as well as the core target that you're going after on that medium. And so again, in the briefing process, to answer your question more specifically, in the briefing process, we've incorporated that level of information so that we have really a completed IMC process where the entire campaign works well together. And it doesn't limit us to just one target per campaign, or, we can go after 3 core targets, and then even the broader audience within a given campaign.
Yeah, very interesting. And one of the things that we've particularly admired about your work is the stuff that you've done in an in-feed environment that's really adapted your approach effectively to that environment. And, we all know this is a very challenging part of media, the digital media landscape for creative work to succeed in. Penn has a couple of thoughts here to anchor us, and then let's talk a bit more about how to succeed in feed.
So similar to how we talked about skippable, and we said that the longer that people watch the ads for and the less it's skipped, the more successful you are. Let's go back. So what we actually find is that time, again, is perhaps the biggest driver of success in feed, but it's actually not the same as skippable. When we dug into the data, we looked to see if we saw the same pattern, and that the longer people engaged with an in-feed ad, would that have the same effect as with a skippable ad? And the answer is actually no. It's the reverse. In our data, 6-second ads are actually delivering more branded impressions, 28% more branded impressions than longer ads when they're shown in an in-feed environment. And that's like for like, that's not indexed to time length, anything else. That's literally the amount of people who are remembering and can name the brand. Over on the right, you'll see that those ads that are longer than 6 seconds, they're in view for 6.1 seconds. That's over twice as long that they're in screen for, but they're delivering just 29% of branded impressions. Whereas the 6-second ads only in view for 2.4 seconds and delivering 37% of branded impressions. So that's where that increase is coming from. So somehow we've flipped things where shorter ads are more effective in feed, and people who watch ads for less are more likely to retain branded impressions. What that is again, it's not necessarily as clean cut as that. When we look at the ads that are being shown, what we realize is a real pattern towards the ads that succeed in feed. It's about how much of the ad you see as a percentage. So with those short ads, people are seeing more of a complete story, and that's delivering on the full objective instead of being scrolled before you get to the point.
And hey, here are some great examples of that.
Just get to the clicker. Some examples that we've seen.
Yeah, and this will leave everybody wanting to run out to Sonic and get one of these delicious, I think, Halloween slushes or something. Bob, talk to us about these examples and more broadly about, obviously you're doing some great food romancing here. Why are you doing that here, and how do you think about the role for this kind of work?
Absolutely. And so, what we have learned really through testing first and foremost, but then also in market executions, especially on the social or digital platform, is that the shorter, more focused content really does generate higher rates of completion for us. As you've seen on the spots that were shared, we really punch in first and foremost with our logo. We want the branding. It's a very important branding cues that we're looking for. But then secondarily, it's getting the attention of the consumer. Because in this, as this is no secret, everyone knows this, attention spans are much shorter, multitasking is much greater, and in fact, multiple screens are still being viewed. I would almost bet that everybody has more than one screen up at this point in time. And so at any rate, we learned that we really had to punch in and grab the attention of the consumer. And that's where food romancing comes in. And so what is most important, and that is the sizzle of the burger or of the bacon or the cheese pool. And so, we sell food. It took us a while to remember that we sold food and not comedy, because we had all of our linear TV creative was all about comedy. It's like, no, we sell food. And so at any rate, when we started really leaning into food romancing on social platforms, it really, really did drive performance for us.
So I love that, and I would love to hear from Tara and Pierre as well, because you both have, and we've shown some examples where you've both told stories, right? And what Barb's saying here is, you know, attention spans are short. We just have to get to the meat, literally, in your case, as fast as possible. What do you guys think of that? How do we combine some of these age-old effective creative techniques in these new digital formats?
And in our experience, it really goes back to what Pierre highlighted, which is what's the objective of that? And Barb talked about it too. What's the objective of that touch point? So in a banner ad or a social environment, oftentimes it's just about a salience, a reminder message. We have to distill down what's the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish with that audience, and then focus, you know, what you can during that short interaction with the consumer on that objective. So it may just be as simple as, here's what we stand for, and here's a really well branded ad that takes advantage of distinctive assets. And it's not trying to do a lot more than that. Like, it's not trying to be humorous, or it's not trying to tell a story in addition, because you have such a short amount of time. And I think that's that sort of purposeful design intent in the briefing stage has been really helpful to driving higher efficiency in terms of the results we see from those touch points.
Yeah, I too am aligned with that approach and those comments. I think that, you know, again, it comes down to the comms plan. You know, where are you telling your overarching message? In my experience, many of the mistakes in our business with any client is that they try to say too much at once, you know, so very focused objectives per unit is really important. Though I am also interested in the data you showed, you know, because I think, again, it goes back to the objective. What is, you know, a brand impression, and more importantly, in the consumer journey, what's the half-life of that impression? You know, like, how long will that work on someone? It would certainly, you would guess, wouldn't work over a longer length of time. I think for things to have meaning in people's lives and to have a longer half-life, you have to catch them when they're ready to listen, and with things that have earned media value, so that people will be talking about them and sharing them.
So let me ask you, who are talking very much about the importance of the objectives. Do you feel that you can do more complex brand building messaging in some of these digital formats? Are there some that you would absolutely exclude from that role? Talk a little bit more in detail about the right horse for the right course. I
like it. It rhymes. It's catchy. If it rhymes, I'm on board right off the bat. Well, I'm interested in what my fellow panelists have to say. I'd say for my part, you know, it all starts with the idea and how you're creating value for the consumer, you know, and how you carve a place in their minds and in their hearts. I put it kind of simply when I talk to my creative teams is we do two things. We make tools or we make toys. You know, we do something that benefits someone's life directly, or we entertain them. Sometimes we do both. But for me, that's the core of the beginning of, you know, how to have a relationship with the consumer. And then you divide it up into the right places and the right spaces for the overarching kind of plan in terms of how to reach them, how to remind them, et cetera, et cetera.
I love that. Tools or toys. That's great. That's really interesting. Terrell, your thoughts. Barb, your thoughts on that. Do you have tools and toys in your repertoires?
Well, just to interject briefly, and then I'll let Barb wrap us up. I think in our business model, which is relatively short purchase cycles and more immediacy driven messages, that oftentimes it is just about remaining top of mind, and salience is a very common goal. But I think when you talk about digital, to the point of this talk overall, it's a lot more complicated than that. I think the purpose of a banner ad on your morning weather channel could be very different than the way we interact in a more social environment, like a Snapchat or a TikTok, where we're using an influencer to really tell more of a story of what's the brand purpose and what's the brand message, and maybe even the origin of a new product and how it was developed. So it's not to say they're all in the same bucket, because I think they serve very different purposes within the realm of digital, even within the realm of something that's technically scrollable. I think you really have to design for what's your intent in terms of what the net takeaway for the consumer is meant to be.
Yeah, and so yes, I'll wrap it up by saying I'm in total alignment with what Tara and Pierre have both said, and they couldn't be more correct on all of those fronts. And the fact is, you do have to think about what platform you're advertising on and what the purpose is, what the objective is. And so what is the message? Is it brand building versus just trying to sell a garlic butter bacon burger, and so yeah, so there are so many factors that come into play, especially when you're deciding what your media mix might look like on any paid social or digital channels. And so, yeah, very nicely said. I just might also say, as we think about even utilization of YouTube versus Facebook, we use them totally different. And so the 6-second ads that we may have on Facebook would not necessarily would not necessarily see the same benefit on YouTube, because those that are on YouTube are there, really probably by choice and to watch specific videos and programs. And so their attention span might be a little bit longer. And so at any rate, let's try to wrap it up. I want to be conscientious of time as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to grab one last comment from you, Barb, because I know you may have to drop. Are there any no-goes from your perspective? Like one thing, don't do this.
Oh goodness, I haven't thought about that. I always think of all the positives as opposed to all the. Well, I guess I would say is the one thing not to do is just to assume that creative is all created equally. Or advertising is all created equally, which we've touched on numerous times. It is, linear TV is much different than social, than some of the digital channels. And so you really do have to think about how your briefing process and your target audience compared to the message you're trying to deliver.
Yeah, thank you, Barb. Pierre, what's your never do this?
I do need to drop. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb.
Thank you.
I think there are two things that I always say to clients in terms of never to do. One is never to forget what it's like to be a consumer. It's very easy for us to talk to each other and to ourselves when we're on our campuses or virtual campuses. But I think, going back to skippable ads, what's your experience with the skippable ad personally, and how would you interact with it? I think you have to start there. And the other is what I touched on earlier, which is never try to say too many things at once. It's always the depth of communications.
Yeah, thank you. Tara, what's your one watch out?
It seems really silly, but it's a mistake we've made so many times, not to evaluate everything on the big screen, because I think we sit in copy review meetings and look at in-feed creative on a giant wall screen and forget to look at it in our tiny little phone within the context of the frame that it's going to be in. And that's where you notice these things, like you have to be really close in, or it's so small you can't even see what's going on. So I just think, building on Pierre's point, putting yourself in that consumer, how they're going to see it in the context that they're going to see it in, and try to keep our minds in that frame rather than inside our walls.
Fabulous. Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists, Pierre, Tara, Barb, and Ped, for a great session. Very interesting, very informative. And digital advertising is indeed dead.